Hello, I'm wintering and thought you may be as well. I hope you enjoy this compilation of real bride stories that I've heard in my bridal sewing shop through the years. Enjoy. Beth was a bride of mine who lived in a nearby town. She was the kind of client whose laughter filled my studio. Her smile could brighten even the darkest, busiest days here. When I worked with her, she was on the verge of the happiest day of her life, her wedding day. But the journey to that moment has been filled with twists and turns that she never saw coming. A year before the wedding, doubts clouded the mind of her fiancé, Mark. It wasn't that he saw any fault with her. She was everything he had ever dreamed of. It's just, he had always been the kind of person to overthink things, to ponder the what-ifs and maybes. And then he often found himself replaying moments in his life when he hadn't been there for the people that he loved. He missed his big brother's college graduation because he went kayaking with a friend. Kayaking. Ugh. He felt like such a jerk for that one. When his grandmother was terminal with cancer, he only visited her a handful of times. He would give anything now to go back and listen to her stories. They were repetitious at the time. Now, they're fading treasures. The details are getting blurry and can never be recovered. Because of this negative trait of his, he feared he wasn't ready for the responsibility of marriage. He had a track record of letting people down when they needed him the most. Meanwhile, Beth's heart ached for the day when Mark would finally pop the question, but uncertainty lingered. Was it her? Was there something he was waiting on? There was an unspoken shadow cast on their future. Then, on an ordinary day after a jog, Beth felt a strange tingling in her feet. By morning, the sensation had spread, and her fingertips began to almost buzz with pain, and they moved slowly and awkwardly, like she was learning to operate a marionette. Within moments, she found herself collapsing to the floor in agony. Unable to move, she dialed her mother for help. An ambulance took Beth to the hospital where doctors diagnosed her with Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare and frightening illness that attacks the nervous system. Her health rapidly declined, and she was placed in a medically induced coma, fighting for her life. The neurologist informed her parents that there was a lot of hope for Beth's survival, but the path to it would be uncertain, and the recovery process could be long and difficult. It would likely get much worse before getting better. Beth's parents took turns staying by her bedside. They phoned Mark and let him know the severity of what was going on. Meanwhile, 2 states away, Mark was faced with a dilemma. He had an essential interview for a long-awaited promotion, a culmination of years of hard work. Yet, as he sat in that room, his thoughts were consumed by Beth lying in a hospital bed, fighting a battle he couldn't comprehend. In that moment, the job paled in comparison to the woman that he loved. He forcefully began throwing his clothes into his suitcase. He caught the next flight home, knowingly leaving his aspirations behind for the chance to be by Beth's side. Night after night, Mark sat vigil by her bedside. He turned restlessly in the plastic-coated recliner in her room. The sheet would slip to the floor over and over again. He couldn't even pass the time with sleep. He had to face his thoughts day and night. The sight of her frail form hooked to monitors stirred emotions he never knew he had. It was then, in the quiet of the hospital room, that he realized the depth of his love for Beth. This still wasn't enough to cause him to give in to the idea of considering himself to be good husband material. But an unexplained visitation a few days later would prevent him from avoiding the subject any longer. A few nights later, a new nurse came by the room and only glanced at Beth's vitals. Mark wondered why she was in there. He didn't recognize her. She complimented Mark on his steadfastness. She introduced herself and said that she had been working the neighboring room, but wanted to stop in to say how much she appreciated his unwavering support for Beth. She said, "You are a very faithful husband. Many of our patients have spouses that only check in once a day." With that, she swiftly slipped through the glass doors and went back down the hallway. Mark didn't dare try to correct her. He wondered if this was a sign and that he was being nudged toward a commitment by some greater power. Regret gnawed at him for the times he had doubted himself and their relationship. That night, as the hands of the large wall clock glided by the 3 o'clock hour, he silently promised to marry Beth and to be there for her no matter what. But really, what good did that do? She still laid there, wasting away, not knowing how much he loved her. They needed her to turn a corner. What was going to be the magic elixir to give her the strength to wake up and recover? Weeks turned into an eternity as Beth fought a battle within herself. The coma had taken its toll, leaving her a shadow of her former self. She had lost 20 pounds and could not even breathe on her own, but she fought like a warrior. Her silent, still strength could be felt in the room. As she gradually improved, the tubes and cords were removed one by one. She could breathe on her own. She could open her eyes. Then she could sit up on her own. Eventually, her determination shone through as she underwent grueling rehabilitation to regain the simplest of abilities: to eat, to speak, to walk. Mark never left her side, sacrificing his dreams and aspirations to be the pillar of support that Beth needed. During the hundreds of hours he sat in the dim room with only the sounds of medical devices, he grew to know that he was no longer the inconsiderate, immature boy that he was ashamed of. He could see in himself that, strengthened with a purpose, he would do anything for Beth. He began to plan a proposal that she would never forget. Weeks later, they were in the bright, open rehab area of the hospital. This was their daily challenge: 2 workouts a day. They were painful and often disheartening, but Beth was gradually growing in strength. It was working, albeit slowly. Beth was making her way in baby steps through the parallel bars. Learning to walk again had proven to be her greatest challenge. Perspiration dotted the top of her quivering lips. As she took those final, uncertain steps between the bars, reaching the end with Mark waiting there, his heart pounded with hope. He dropped to one knee. Tears filled the eyes of nurses and onlookers as he proposed, his voice trembling with emotion. A triumphant cheer resounded from the nurses' station. Even the grumpy head nurse had to look away so as not to feel the love in the room. It was a moment of euphoria, a symbol of their unwavering love, even in adversity. Months passed, and Beth made incredible progress. She was released from rehab, determined to move forward. She eventually found her dream dress and had strength enough to begin to enjoy planning her wedding. She still goes to the gym several days a week, but isn't quite happy with her arm strength yet, so she's having me add these sleeves. I'm happy for her and inspired by her recovery. Her walk down the aisle will be a touching miracle for everyone there on her wedding day. Her steps will be the surest that she has ever taken. Share this story with someone who needs a little hope today. Miracles do still happen, and love does too. The story behind this dress touched me so uniquely that I wanted to share it with you. This dress is a real project that I upcycled. It was a bridesmaid's dress before, and I was asked to bring new life to it using bridal sewing techniques. It sounds so much like a fairy tale that I'm going to tell you 2 stories, and you have to tell me in the comments which one you think is true. As I pinned her in this dress, I asked her, "How did you meet your fiancé?" This is how her dramatic love story occurred. She lived in a very remote area that was surrounded by national forest. Sadly, 2 years ago, the forest began to burn. Her sky was orange and hazy, nothing she hadn't seen before. One night as she slept, she could hear the wind howling and the orange glow grew brighter. She looked out of her window to see that the fire had changed direction unexpectedly. No one on the news had warned her of this before she went to sleep. Her phone beamed no signal. She quickly got dressed and grabbed a duffel bag, stuffing it as she quickly moved through the house. Panic running high, she started her Jeep and almost backed into her garage door. Once she made it to the main gravel road, she drove as fast as she could without losing traction. Soon she came upon a blocked outlet. She could see the raging fire before her in the distance. She spun her SUV around and tore in the other direction. She reached an overlook and pulled aside to survey the direction of the fire. It had snaked around the mountain and had formed a choking hairpin shape around the base. There was now no way out. She turned on all of her lights and climbed to the roof of her Jeep. She waved her LED flare from side to side in a great sweeping motion. Soon, her arms ached from the continual motion. Her eyes stung from the smoke, or perhaps it was her hopeless tears. Finally, a helicopter came and hovered over her. She screamed with all the power she had left. Her throat felt hot and dry, and no sound came out. Her skin burned and felt as if it were melting. A shadow of a man rappelled down and quickly harnessed himself to her. She was lifted out of the inferno with a dizzying speed. She tried to take in the bird's eye view of destruction, but all she could do is hide her face in his rough canvas coat. Finally, as all sound and light muted, her hot, buzzing skin was her only awareness. 3 days later, she could hear beeping and slow breathing. Everything was black and heavy. She felt like there was a large white couch on her chest. Her legs were pinned down, and she couldn't move. The couch, it got heavier and heavier. She tried to lift it, and only a whimper came out. "Easy," she heard a woman's voice say. She tried to speak back. "Move the couch. Move the couch." couch, but nothing would come out. Then she started to see sparkles of light and hear a crackling, fizzing sound inside of her brain. The weight began to lift, and she strained to see what was around her. She slowly realized the couch was actually a small pillow on her stomach, weighing no more than a few ounces. There was no couch. There was no darkness. It was a light hospital room with a young nurse by her side. She looked around and saw a figure entering the room. "Oh, Mr. Green, you came at the perfect time. Michelle is just waking up." "Who is Mr. Green? Where am I?" Michelle felt as if she spoke normally, but barely a whisper came out. "It's okay. Mr. Green is a friend of yours. He was piloting the helicopter that lifted you from the forest fire that has been going on near where you live. He's been making his rounds, checking on all of the rescues for the past few days." "Are you the one I saw coming from the sky?" Michelle felt frustration by her childish, limited vocabulary that she had available to her in her mental haze. "I don't think you ever saw me. I was the pilot. There was another firefighter volunteer that actually pulled you out of there. Good thing, you were about 10 minutes away from that mountain being completely consumed. You were doing well. Several other people were not so lucky." She started to feel heat around her neck and reached toward it. She was met with a soft bandage. She looked at the nurse, who said, "You received some minor burns, but they're healing really well, and we don't expect any lasting effects." The bride's eyes sparkled as I marked her hem. "I guess the rest is history," she said. Now, when she comes to her gown fittings, she has a delicate white, cloud-shaped scar on her neck. That, and the sky blue color of her gown, will always remind her of the pilot who lifted her out of the blaze and out of her loneliness. This next story is about a little girl whose mother walked out when she was only 3 years old. Her dad rose to the occasion and gave her the best childhood that he could. Her wardrobe was an eclectic mix of hair bows and camo. As the years ticked by, she became a beautiful young lady, and it was time to go to her first formal. Without a mother active in her life, she would come to fittings alone as I transformed a bridesmaid's dress into a lovely custom formal gown. I made sure that every stitch was sewn with love so that she would feel beautiful and cherished at her final fitting. She loved the gown and looked beautiful in it the night of her formal. I never really gave that dress a second thought. I knew that it felt very special to me as I worked on it. My dad walked out when I was 6, so I know how big that void can be. However, I moved on to other sewing jobs, and this dress faded from my memory of projects as bridal seasons came and went. But a couple weeks ago, my son got down on one knee and proposed to this special young lady. I had no idea during the sewing job that I was fitting my future daughter-in-law. What an honor. Now, tell me in the comments, which story is true? I'll give you a hint. I think congratulations are in order. We took an expensive designer wedding gown and used color change dye on it with the hopes that it would turn from traditional ivory indoors to a party time pink when the bride steps into the sun. Let's see if the project scores a perfect 10 or if it falls flat and ruins the gown. A charitable organization gave me this gown to upcycle into something that could be sold to support their mission. If I botch this dress with this innovative and untested dye, they will receive no money from the gown. But if it turns out amazing, and with the help and intention of the internet, then they can sell it to support their shelter that gets women and children back on their feet after some of the darkest events of their lives. I feel compelled to take this risk. I really want to help their cause. While we work on changing this dress, let me tell you the unbelievable love story of the model that I hired for this project. The parallels between the change that this dress would go through and the changes my model went through are uncanny. It's a story that seems too good to be true. Love is all about transformation. This bride grew up riding horses through Virginia fields, became a figure skater in her teens, and then became a professional figure skater who tours around the world. She was a solo skater working full-time on a cruise ship. After a few tumbles in her quest for love, she had almost given up hope. How would she find the one when floating around the world in the middle of nowhere? Thankfully, one excursion was different. She met another ice skater, and the familiar feeling of love was stirred in her once again.
Neither of us were looking for anything, and it's a tiny spark that grew over time that I did not expect at all.
His voice had a casual Australian swagger to it, but his technique on ice was refined perfection. During that cruise, her fears of getting hurt again thawed. By the end of the tour, their connection was undeniable. They were determined to keep in touch and maintain a long-distance relationship as their next ship assignment sailed them in opposite directions. It would take hours of agonizing, soul-searching phone calls to come up with a plan to be able to be together again. This is a Jenny Yu designer dress. She is known for her work with rich silks, luxurious chiffons, and delicate laces. Her designs are elegant and refined. This gown is a silk A-line with a fashion-forward slit and a dropped waist. The silk makes dyeing it risky. While cotton loves to absorb dye, silk sometimes doesn't take dye evenly, or the dye can sometimes fail to set unless the silk is brought to near boiling temperatures. We can't put this gown through that. Also, this dye is very different from traditional dyes. This is truly an experiment. As if that's not enough of a challenge, this dye requires one more special detail. The dress has to hang in total darkness while it dries with the dye on it. According to the instructions, the color cannot be activated while it is setting. It doesn't say what will happen if it gets exposed to light while it's drying, and I don't want to find out. The pressure is mounting. We need this dress to sell when we are done with it. I opted for a dip dye process for this dress. The gown has to be spotlessly clean of oils and then undergo a total submersion into a warm dye bath. I'm also adding some extra matching silk fabric so that we can embellish the gown after the dye has been applied. We want this to be one of a kind in every sense. If you're interested in trying this dye out for yourself, I have a coupon code for you. The code expires and YouTube is forever, so if the code is still active when you see this, you'll find it pinned in the comments. Now for more of the love story. After the agony of working through a long-distance relationship for a year and a half, they were both about to lose their minds. Night after night of phone calls were contributing to the heartache that only a long-distance relationship can give. Finally, they had another season of time together that fate seemed to arrange. He had a back injury and was recovering in the States while she was between ship assignments. "I don't think I can do this anymore," she said one night. He let out a heavy sigh. "I've been thinking. I've come up with a way that we can be together again. Would you consider, while I'm here recovering, maybe let me train you on pair skating?" That was a big ask. She had never skated pairs before. And on top of that, after her failed relationships that broke her heart and her faith in love, this was a lot to consider. Just dating in person was a big step. But this would mean working together in long-term assignments as well. What if they didn't work out as a couple or as skaters? It would be absolute misery. She was going through taking baby steps in trust to having to completely put her life, career, well-being, and even her body into his hands. A bad fall hurts. She tossed in her bed that night. She rolled over to switch sides as often as her mind did. After a few nights of restless sleep, she told him over breakfast one morning, "I'm in. Let's do it." It was time to practice, and the same bravery that allowed her to open her heart again allowed him to lift her into the air for the first time. There were nervous technicalities to think about, but once she found her balance, it was exhilarating. There was no going back. She was in love. Her trust had to grow, both in her relationship emotionally and with believing that he wouldn't drop her. They learned to move and sync as skaters, and more importantly, they aligned their personal lives. Their trust grew into a desire for a lifetime commitment, and they eventually married at a beautiful vineyard in the States. Let's take a cue from them and go all in with this dress experiment. We've done our best and followed every step of the instructions. There's nothing left to do but try it out. Now, for the moment of truth. Watch this gown turn in the sun. This gown was an absolute win. Do you want a traditional ivory look for your indoor ceremony, but want your dress color to be the life of the party? It's so interactive, fun, and the best of both worlds. Heads were turning throughout this shoot. Also, the dye manufacturer, Solar Dust, has graciously offered a limited time coupon. If you want to go all in on your dress, you can also dye your own gown by using this fascinating product. I put the code in the pinned comment. In my next challenging video, I go into even more detail of how to dye with this magical, amazing stuff, and even how to paint designs into the gown with it. Definitely subscribe so you don't miss that. This bride received a cheap scam wedding dress in the mail for her big day. We had 10 hours to find a beautiful dress and fit it to her, or her wedding day would be ruined. Christina was an unforgettable bride of mine. She lived on a cruise liner as a professional singer. Planning a wedding while at sea was a difficult task. She would only have 1 week on land to tie up the loose ends before her wedding day. She ordered her dream dress online and had it shipped to her home so that when she arrived back to the States, it would be ready and waiting for her. She had the forethought to know that she would likely need alterations, so many months ahead, she scheduled a private, one-day fitting session with me. I normally reserve these days only for cases such as this. out-of-town brides or celebrities with tight schedules. I had a very full week. It was peak bridal season, and there were dozens of other brides booked before and after her 5-hour exclusive slot. I felt comfortable with this. She ordered a beautiful gown with a customized fit, so the alterations would be minimal at worst. She would likely only need her hem adjusted and maybe a bustle, or so we thought. Welcome to my sewing cottage. This story came to my mind today while I was working on the top of a wedding gown. I'm adding boning and lining it. Well, anyways, this story is definitely worth keeping alive. So back to it. When Christina finally came home, she excitedly opened the package of her dream wedding gown. It was the moment she had waited for her whole life. Childhood drawings of her as a bride, bridal magazine pages, dog-eared and worn, swirled through her head as she sliced the glorious box open. Funny they would wrap a wedding gown in clear green-tinted cellophane. She carefully lifted the dress out of the box and placed the bag on her bed. It seemed smaller than she expected, but maybe it was vacuum sealed? Well, she cut open the bag and slowly pulled out the monstrosity. It was wrinkled and creased, yes, but as the skirt unrolled, she inhaled sharply and felt her head begin to spin a little. She traced her fingers along the sloppily sewn mass of greenish beads that encircled the neckline. The stitches were large and childlike. The net skirt was of the cheapest costume variety. It was abrasive to the touch and to the eye. Instead of a full ball gown, it flatly laid as a nightgown across her bedspread. She fell to her knees and created a constellation of hot, fat tears on the wooden floor beneath her face. After she found a quiet, forced composure, she picked up her phone to text me to let me know that we had suffered a plot twist. Our next course of action was something I never had to do before. She came to my shop the next morning for her appointment. I only had a 5-hour slot reserved for her, but I figured I could work up to 10 hours that day if I pulled some overtime. First off, I had her put the dress on in case it wasn't that bad. It was that bad. The dress was impossible to wear. Honestly, not one particular detail stands out to me. It mainly reminded me of a child's Halloween costume. She needed an entirely different new dress immediately because I would still need to alter it to fit her. At her height and lovely body shape, a sample dress wouldn't fit. Whatever we found would have to be altered. I had an idea. I had a rack in the back of gowns that we could dig through. Every dress told a unique story. Some were from brides who had their wedding canceled and they never wanted to see their dress again. They donated it. Some were tired of storing their dress and wanted to see it live again, so they gave it to me to give away as needed. Some were slightly damaged so as to be unsellable, so local gown shops would give them to me to repair and use, or to cut up for fabric. Whatever the reasons, we had this motley crew of dresses to choose from. We rolled up our sleeves and began pulling the gowns. One was a yellowed ivory velvet gown. Impossible. The next was a crunchy taffeta gown that, well, it had pretty lace, but an orange stain was smeared down the front of the skirt. One by one, we eliminated the dresses. I unzipped a black garment bag and was intrigued. This gown had what we call AB crystals on it. These are the stones that reflect soft rainbows of color, pink, blue, depending on how the facets are struck by the light. There was a lot of personality in this gown and almost a showmanship to it. The full tulle skirt and dropped waist could be flattering to my bride. I pulled it out and I showed it to her. An openness came across her face. We scurried to the changing room and wiggled it on. It was too small. We couldn't get it to zip. But we decided to go ahead and look at it and worry about how to fit it later. She emerged to step in front of the mirror, and we both missed it up. This was it. It was a better fit to her than any dress she could have shopped for. She gave a breezy twirl and ended by facing the mirror with a confirming nod. I could see the love in her eyes as they locked onto her own reflection. Now, I had the challenge of making it fit in the few hours that we had left. I took the gown to the back and sewed for a few hours, contouring the bust, hemming the crinolines, and changing the zipper into a corset back to give her a little more room. As my workday came to a close, we put her into the dress one more time. The ribbon swished back and forth as I laced her corset. I tightened the laces, and the back turned into the ideal traditional V. Nothing about this dress conveyed the panic and heartbreak she wore the day before. She stepped into the lights and took in her image. The stones were bright like her personality. Her skirt was steamed and flowing. We felt so much peace and relief and beauty in that moment. Then she said, "Oh no! The time has gotten away from me. I'm supposed to get to the post office before it closes." My eyes darted from side to side. "Oh, here, hurry. I'll get you out of it. What are you needing to pick up?" "I mail-ordered my silk flowers for my wedding." "What?" She squealed with laughter and fell back into my fluffy chaise lounge. "Oh, I'm just kidding. You should have seen your face. We have pros doing the flowers, don't worry." And really, there was no need to. Her wedding day turned out perfectly. Now for this last bonus story. It is fiction, but it's a beloved classic. Join me in the reading of the proposal chapter of Jane Eyre. As I do a plethora of alterations on this beautiful minimalistic dress today, I thought you would enjoy a reading of some of the bridal moments in Jane Eyre. It's one of my favorite books. Let me know in the comments what a few of your favorite books are. Per usual, if you have a question about any of the sewing I'm doing, ask me in the comments. Enjoy the sewing as you create today as well. This excerpt is from chapter 23 of Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. A splendid midsummer shone over England. Skies so pure, suns so radiant, as they were then seen in long succession, seldom favor even singly our wave-girt land. It was as if a band of Italian days had come from the south, like a flock of glorious passenger birds, and lighted to rest them on the cliffs of Albion. The hay was all got in. The fields round Thornfield were green and shorn, the roads white and baked. The trees were in their dark prime, hedge and wood, full-leaved and deeply tinted, contrasted well with the sunny hue of the cleared meadows between. On Midsummer Eve, Adele, weary with gathering wild strawberries and hay-laying half the day, had gone to bed with the sun. I watched her drop asleep, and when I left her, I sought the garden. It was now the sweetest hour of the 24. Day, its fervid fires had wasted, and dew fell cool on panting plain and scorched summit. Where the sun had gone down in simple state, pure of the pomp of clouds, spread of a solemn purple, burning with the light of red jewel and furnace flame at one point, on one hill peak, and extending high and wide, soft and still softer, over half heaven. The east had its own charm of fine deep blue, and its own modest gem, a casino and solitary star. Soon it would boast the moon, but she was yet beneath the horizon. I walked a while on the pavement, but a subtle, well-known scent, that of a cigar, stole from some window. I saw the library casement open a handbreadth. I knew I might be watched thence, so I went apart into the orchard. No nook in the grounds more sheltered and more Eden-like. It was full of trees. It bloomed with flowers. A very high wall shut it out from the court. On one side, on the other, a beech avenue screened it from the lawn. At the bottom was a sunk fence, its sole separation from lonely fields, a winding walk bordered with laurels and terminating in a giant horse chestnut, circled at the base by a seat led down to the fence. Here one could wander unseen, While such honey-dew fell, such silence reigned, such gloaming gathered. I felt as if I could haunt such shade forever, but in treading the flower and fruit parterres at the upper part of the enclosure, enticed there by the light the now rising moon cast on this more open quarter, my steps stayed, not by sound, not by sight, but once more by a warning fragrance. Sweetbriar and southern wood, jasmine, pink, and rose have long been yielding their evening sacrifice of incense. This new scent is neither of shrub nor flower. It is, I know it well, it is Mr. Rochester's cigar. I look around and I listen. I see trees laden with ripening fruit. I hear a nightingale warbling in a wood half a mile off. No moving form is visible, no coming step audible, but that perfume increases. I must flee. I make for the wicket leading to the shrubbery, and I see Mr. Rochester entering. I step aside into the ivy recess. He will not stay long. He will soon return whence he came, and if I sit still, he will never see me. But no, eventide is as pleasant to him as it is to me, and this antique garden as attractive. And he strolls on, now lifting the gooseberry tree branches to look at the fruit, large as plums, with which they are now laden, now taking a ripe cherry from the wall, now stooping towards a knot of flowers, either to inhale their fragrance or to admire the dew beads on their petals. A great moth goes humming by me. It alights on a plant at Mr. Rochester's foot. He sees it and bends to examine it. Now he has his back towards me, thought I, and he is occupied too. Perhaps if I walk softly, I can slip away unnoticed. I trode on an edging of turf that the crackle of the pebbly gravel might not betray me. He was standing among the beds at a yard or two distant from where I had to pass. The moth apparently engaged him. I shall get by very well, I meditated. As I crossed his shadow, thrown long over the garden by the moon, not yet risen high, he said quietly, without turning, "Jane, come and look at this fellow." I had made no noise. He had not eyes behind. Could his shadow feel? I started at first, and then I approached him. "Look at his wings," said he. "He reminds me rather of a West Indian insect. One does not often see so large and gay a night rover in England. There, he has flown." The moth roamed away. I was sheepishly retreating also, but Mr. Rochester followed me, and when we reached the wicket, he said, "Turn back. On so lovely a night, it is a shame to sit in the house, and surely no one can wish to go to bed while sunset is thus at meeting with moonrise. It is one of my faults that, though my tongue is sometimes prompt enough in an answer, there are times when it sadly fails me in framing an excuse, and always the lapse occurs at some crisis when a facile word or plausible pretext is specially wanted to get me out of painful embarrassment. I did not like to walk at this hour alone with Mr. Rochester in the shadowy orchard, but I could not find a reason to allege for leaving him. I followed with lagging step and thoughts busily bent on discovering a means of extrication, but he himself looked so composed and so grave also, I became ashamed of feeling any confusion. The evil, if evil existent or prospective there was, seemed to lie with me only. His mind was unconscious and quiet. "Jane," he recommenced, as we entered the laurel walk and slowly strayed down in the direction of the sunk fence and the horse chestnut. Thornfield is a pleasant place in summer, is it not? Yes, sir. You must have become, in some degree, attached to the house, you who have an eye for natural beauties and a good deal of the organ of adhesiveness. I'm attached to it, indeed. And though I don't comprehend how it is, I perceive you have acquired a degree of regard for that foolish little child Adele, too, and even for simple Dame Fairfax. Yes, sir. In different ways, I have an affection for both. And would it be sorry to part with them? Yes. Pity, he said, and sighed and paused. It is always the way of events in this life, he continued presently. No sooner have you gotten settled in a pleasant resting place than a voice calls out to you to rise and move on, for the hour of repose is expired. Must I move on, sir? I asked. Must I leave Thornfield? I believe you must, Jane. I'm sorry, Janet, but I believe indeed you must. This was a blow, but I did not let it prostrate me. Well, sir, I shall be ready when the order to march comes. It is come now. I must give it tonight. Then you are going to be married, sir? Exactly. Precisely. With your usual acuteness, you have hit the nail straight on the head. Soon, sir? Very soon, that is, Miss Eyre. And you'll remember, Jane, the first time rumor, plainly intimated you that it was my intention to put my old bachelor's neck into the sacred noose, to enter into the holy state of matrimony, to take Miss Ingram to my bosom. In short, she's an extensive armful, but that's not the point. One can't have too much of a very excellent thing as my beautiful Blanche. Well, as I was saying, listen to me, Jane. You are not turning your head to look after more moths, are you? That was only a lady clock, child, flying away home. I wish to remind you that it was you who first said to me, with that discretion I respect in you, with the foresight, prudence, and humility which befit your responsible and dependent position, that in case I married Miss Ingram, both you and little Adele had better trot forthwith. I pass over the sort of slur conveyed in this suggestion on the character of my beloved. Indeed, when you are far away, Janet, I'll try to forget it. I shall notice only its wisdom, which is such that I have made it in my law of action. Adele must go to school, and you, Miss Eyre, must get a new situation. Yes, sir. I will advertise immediately, and meantime, I suppose I may stay here till I find another shelter to betake myself to, but I stopped, feeling it would not do to risk a long sentence, for my voice was not quite under command. In about a month, I hope to be a bridegroom, continued Mr. Rochester, and in the interim, I shall myself look out for employment and an asylum for you. Thank you, sir. I'm sorry to give... Oh, no need to apologize. I consider that when a dependent does her duty as well as you have done yours, she has a sort of claim upon her employer for any little assistance he can conveniently render her. Indeed, I have already, through my future mother-in-law, heard of a place that I think will suit. It is to undertake the education of the 5 daughters of Miss Diocenes O'Gall of Bitternut Lodge, Connaught, Ireland. You'll like Ireland, I think. There's such warm-hearted people there, they say. It's a long way off, sir. No matter. A girl of your sense will not object to the voyage or the distance. Not the voyage, but the distance, and then the sea is a barrier. From what, Jane? From England and from Thornfield and, well, from you, sir. I said this almost involuntarily, and with as little sanction of free will, my tears gushed out. I did not cry so as to be heard. However, I avoided sobbing. The thought of Mrs. O'Gall and Bitternut Lodge struck cold to my heart, and colder the thought of all the brine and foam, destined, as it seemed, to reach between me and the master at whose side I now walked. In the coldest, the remembrance of the wider ocean, wealth, caste, custom intervened between me and what I naturally and inevitably loved. It's a long way, I again said. It is, to be sure, and when you get to Bitternut Lodge, Connaught, Ireland, I shall never see you again, Jane. That's morally certain. I never go to Ireland, not having myself much of a fancy for the country. We have been good friends, Jane, have we not? Yes, sir. And when friends are on the eve of separation, they like to spend the little time that remains to them close to each other. Come, we'll talk over the voyage and the parting quietly, half an hour or so, while the stars enter into their shining life up in the heaven yonder. Here is the chestnut tree. Here is the bench at its old roots. Come, we will sit there in the peace tonight, though we should never be more destined to sit there together. He seated me and himself. It is a long way to Ireland, Janet, and I am sorry to send my little friend on such weary travels, but if I can't do better, how is it to be helped? Are you anything akin to me, do you think, Jane? I could risk no sort of answer by this time. My heart was still. Because, he said, I sometimes have a queer feeling with regard to you, especially when you are near me, as now. It is as if a string somewhere under my left ribs tightly and inextricably knotted to a similar string situated in the corresponding quarter of your little frame, and if that boisterous channel and 200 miles or so of land come broad between us, I'm afraid that cord of communication will be snapped. And then I've a nervous notion I should take to bleeding inwardly. As for you, you'd forget me. That I never should, sir. You know, impossible to proceed. Jane, do you hear that nightingale singing in the wood? Listen. In listening, I sobbed convulsively, for I could repress what I endured no longer. I was obliged to yield, and I was shaken from head to foot with acute distress. When I did speak, it was only to express an impetuous wish that I had never been born or never come to Thornfield. Because you are sorry to leave it? The vehemence of emotion, stirred by grief and love within me, was claiming mastery and struggling for full sway, and asserting a right to predominate, to overcome, to live, rise, and reign at last, yes, and to speak. I grieve to leave Thornfield. I love Thornfield. I love it, because I have lived in it a full and delightful life, momentarily at least. I have not been trampled on. I have not been petrified. I have not been buried with inferior minds and excluded from every glimpse of communication with what is bright and energetic and high. I have talked face to face with what I reverence, with what I delight in, with an original, a vigorous and expanded mind. I have known you, Mr. Rochester, and it strikes me with terror and anguish to feel I absolutely must be torn from you forever. I see the necessity of departure, and it is like looking on the necessity of death. Where do you see the necessity? He asked suddenly. Where? You, sir, have placed it before me. In what shape? In the shape of Miss Ingram, a noble and beautiful woman. Your bride. My bride? What bride? I have no bride. But you will have. Yes, I will. I will, he set his teeth. Then I must go. You have said it yourself. No, you must stay. I swear it, and the oath shall be kept. I tell you I must go, I retorted, rousing to something like passion. Do you think I could stay to become nothing to you? Do you think I'm an automaton, a machine without feelings? And you can bear to have my morsel of bread snatched from my lips and my drop of living water dashed from my cup? Do you think because I am poor, obscure, plain, and little, I am soulless and heartless? You think wrong. I have as much soul as you, and as full of heart. And if God had gifted me with some beauty, as much wealth, I should have made it as hard for you to leave me as it now is for me to leave you. I am not talking to you now through the medium of custom, conventionalities, or even of mortal flesh. It is my spirit that addresses your spirit, just as if both had passed through the grave and we stood at God's feet equal, as we are. As we are, repeated Mr. Rochester. So, he added, enclosing me in his arms, gathering me to his breast, pressing his lips on my lips. So, Jane. Yes, so, sir, I rejoined, and yet not so, for you are a married man, or as good as a married man, and wed to one inferior to you, to one with whom you have no sympathy, whom I do not believe you truly love, for I have seen and heard you sneer at her. I would scorn such a union. Therefore, I am better than you. Let me go. Where to, Jane? To Ireland? Yes, to Ireland. I have spoken my mind, and I can go anywhere now. Jane, be still. Don't struggle so like a wild, frantic bird that is rending its own plumage in its desperation. I am no bird, and no net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will which I now exert to leave you. Another effort to set me at liberty, and I stood erect before him. And your will shall decide your destiny, he said. I offer you my hand, my heart, and a share of all my possessions. You play a farce, which I merely laugh at. I ask you to pass through life at my side, to be my second self and my best earthly companion. For that fate, you have already made your choice and must abide by it. Jane, be still a few moments. You are overexcited. I will be still too. A waft of wind came sweeping down the laurel walk and trembled through the boughs of the chestnut. It wandered away, away to an indefinite distance. It died. The nightingale's song was then the only voice of the hour, and listening to it, I again wept. Mr. Rochester sat quiet, looking at me gently and seriously. Some time passed before he spoke. He at last said, "Come to my side, Jane, and let us explain and understand one another." I will never again come to your side. I am torn away now and cannot return. But Jane, I summon you as my wife. It is you only I intend to marry." I was silent. I thought he mocked me. "Come, Jane, come hither. Your bride stands between us." He rose and with a stride reached me. "My bride is here," he said, again drawing me to him. "Because my equal is here, and my likeness. Jane, will you marry me?" Still, I did not answer, and still I writhed myself from his grasp, for I was still incredulous. "Do you doubt me, Jane?" "Entirely." "You have no faith in me?" "Not a whit." "Am I a liar in your eyes?" he asked passionately. "Little skeptic, you shall be convinced. What love have I for Miss Ingram? None, in that you know. What love is she for me? None, as I have taken pains to prove. I caused a rumor to reach her that my fortune was not a third of what was supposed, and after that I presented myself to see the result. It was coldness, both from her and her mother. I could not marry Miss Ingram. You strange, you almost unearthly thing. I love you as my own flesh. You, poor and obscure and small and plain as you are, I entreat you to accept me as a husband." "What, me?" I said, beginning in his earnestness and especially in his incivility to credit his sincerity. "Me, who have not a friend in the world but you. If you were my friend, not a shilling. But what have you given me?" "You, Jane. I must have you for my own, entirely my own. Will you be mine? Say yes, quickly." "Mr. Rochester, let me look at your face. Turn to the moonlight." "Why?" "Because I want to read your countenance. Turn." There. You will find it scarcely more legible than a crumpled, scratched page. Read on. Only make haste, for I suffer." His face was very much agitated and very much flushed, and there were strong workings in the features and strange gleams in the eyes. "Oh, Jane, you torture me," he exclaimed. "With that searching and yet faithful and generous look, you torture me." "How can I do that? If you are true and your offer real, my only feelings to you must be gratitude and devotion. They cannot torture." "Gratitude," he said, and added wildly, "Jane, accept me quickly. Say, Edward, give me my name, Edward. I will marry you." "Are you in earnest? Do you truly love me? Do you sincerely wish me to be your wife?" "I do, and if an oath is necessary to satisfy you, I swear it." "Then, sir, I will marry you." "Edward, my little wife." "Dear Edward." Come to me entirely now," said he, and added in his deepest tone, speaking in my ear as his cheek was laid to mine, "Make my happiness, I will make yours." "God pardon me," he subjoined ere long, "and man meddle not with me. I have her and will hold her." "There is no one to meddle, sir. I have no kindred to interfere." "No, that is the best of it," he said. And if I had loved him less, I should have thought his accent and look of exultation savage, but sitting by him, roused from the nightmare of parting, called to the paradise of union, I thought only of the bliss given me to drink in so abundant a flow. Again and again he said, "Are you happy, Jane?" And again I answered, "Yes." After which he murmured, It will atone. Have I not found her friendless and cold and comfortless? Will I not guard and cherish and solace her? Is there not love in my heart and constancy in my resolve? It will expatiate at God's tribunal. I know my Maker sanctions what I do. For the world's judgment, I wish my hands thereof. For man's opinion, I defy it. But what had befallen the night? The moon was not yet set, and we were all in shadow. I could scarcely see my master's face, near as I was. And what ailed the chestnut tree? It writhed and groaned, while wind roared in the laurel walk and came sweeping over us. "We must go in," said Mr. Rochester. "The weather changes." "I could have sat with thee till morning, Jane." And so, thought I, could I with you. I should have said so, perhaps, but a livid, vivid spark leapt out of the cloud at which I was looking, and there was a crack, a crash, and a close rattling peal, and I thought only of hiding my dazzled eyes against Mr. Rochester's shoulder. The rain rushed down. He hurried me up the walk, through the grounds, and into the house. But we were quite wet before we could pass the threshold. He was taking off my shawl in the hall and shaking the water out of my loosened hair when Mrs. Fairfax emerged from her room. I did not observe her at first, neither did Mr. Rochester. The lamp was lit. The clock was on the stroke of 12. "Hasten to take off your wet things," said he, "and before you go, good night. Good night, my darling." He kissed me repeatedly. When I looked up on leaving his arms, there stood the widow, pale, grave, and amazed. I only smiled at her and ran upstairs. Explanation will do for another time, thought I. Still, when I reached my chamber, I felt a pang at the idea she should even temporarily misconstrue what she had seen. But joy soon effaced every other feeling, and loud as the wind blew, near and deep as the thunder crashed, fierce and frequent as the lightning gleamed, cataract-like as the rain fell during a storm of 2 hours' duration, I experienced no fear and little awe. Mr. Rochester came thrice to my door in the course of it to ask if I was safe and tranquil, and that was comfort. That was strength for anything. Before I left my bed in the morning, little Adele came running in to tell me the great horse chestnut at the bottom of the orchard had been struck by lightning in the night, and half of it split away. And that, my dears, for any of you who are familiar with this great literary work, that's some amazing foreshadowing. Let me know in the comments if you want me to do a chapter of the marriage scene that's coming up. I would love to do that for you. In the meantime, here is another bridal themed story for you. And if time has passed since I uploaded this and I did do the wedding chapter, I will link to it right here for you to enjoy. May you be well.